Hello and welcome to Summer Shivers. The stories that I'm going to tell today are a little bit scary, and I do consider these to be scary stories that are appropriate for kids, but they are also legitimately a little bit scary because a lot of kids like scary stories. I know not all kids like scary stories, but some really do. I loved scary stories when I was a kid, and when I was working as a librarian, I know those books of scary stories to tell in the dark and Short and Shivery, those were just checked out all the time. Lots of kids, big fans. So I wanted to go ahead and tell some stories that were a little bit scary for those kids who do like scary stories. This first one is a story that I learned from Margaret Reed MacDonald's book of Earth Tales. And I will tell you that I made some significant changes to this story. Now, it's a little bit of an unusual story because Margaret Reed MacDonald collects stories from lots and lots of different places. And then usually she just writes them down in kind of plain American English. But this story is written in her book in a heavy dialect. It's called The Tiny Man, but in dialect, the title is Tiddymun, and that's the title of the story in Margaret Reed MacDonald's book. And it's set originally in a part of England called the Cars, which I believe is a sort of marshy area. And I really liked this story, but I thought that with all the dialects and with it being in kind of an area that a lot of Americans wouldn't be familiar with, if I wanted to tell the story, I needed to do something a little different with it. So I just picked up the whole story and moved it from the Cars in England to the Okefenokee Swamp in South Georgia. So this is my version of the story, The Tiny Man. There are folks who live down in the Okefenokee Swamp, and, you know, life isn't easy there, but it's home. There are alligators and mosquitoes and some supernatural things that live in the swamp witches. And there's this funny little man who they call the Tiny Man. They call him that because he stands not more than 3 feet tall. And the Tiny Man, his hair and his beard are all green like swamp moss. No one's ever heard him speak, but when he laughs, it sounds like the call of an owl on the breeze. Hoo, 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 hoo. And the folks who live down there, they have a saying about the Tiny Man. Tiny man without a name likes to laugh and dance in the rain. As long as there's water in the Okefenokee, ain't no harm gonna come to nobody. And mostly the Tiny Man was good to the people. Every once in a while it would rain, and the swamp would start to fill up with water, and then the water would start to come up toward their homes. And as the waters were rising, the people who lived down there, they would all come to the edge of the swamp, and all together they would chant, "Tiny man without a name, take your waters back again." And then, even though it might continue to rain, the level of the water stopped rising, and their homes were safe. So most of the Tiny Man was good to the people, but it seems like even then they knew that he could be dangerous. Well, there came a time when some folks came down from the big city. They said they were going to develop on the swamp. They were going to drain the water and fill it in, build some strip malls and subdivisions. Now, the swamp folk, they didn't want any part of this, but it didn't seem like they had any say in the matter. So then, these developers, they brought in some workers from the city, and the workers started draining the swamp. Now, this had only been going on for a few days when one of the workers disappeared. No one knew what happened to him. The foreman said probably an alligator got him, and everyone just needed to be a little bit more careful. But it seemed like every few days another worker was disappearing, and they kept blaming it on the alligators, and And it seemed like the city folk, they were able to just bring more workers down from the city every time one disappeared. It didn't really slow them down. And the folks who lived there in the swamp, they felt bad that the workers were disappearing, but they also thought that maybe the city folk were getting what they deserved, and they didn't really want the swamp to be drained. Well, then bad things started happening to the swamp folk too. Their children got sick, they had high fevers. And when they drew up water from the well, it was salty and brackish. And then families would sit down to dinner after making a nice meal for themselves, and before they could get that first forkful to their lips, it would turn rotten. And at first the swamp folk thought maybe this was some mischief caused by a witch, and they painted all of their doorways, all their window frames blue to make sure that witches couldn't get into their homes. But it didn't seem to help, and they had to admit they knew. They knew what the problem was. It was the tiny man. It was right there in their saying, as long as there's water in the Okefenokee, ain't no harm gonna come to nobody. And the water was getting drained from the swamp, and harm was happening. But the swamp folk, they thought, well, but it's not our fault. We don't want them to drain the swamp. And they got an idea. They all got together, came down to the edge of the swamp, every one of them carrying a glass of water. And all together they chanted, "Tiny man without a name, take your waters back again." And they all dumped their water into the swamp. Now, all those glasses of water, it didn't make a difference you could see in the level of the swamp. But it was a gesture. They wanted the tiny man to know that they were on their side. They were on his side. And at first they weren't sure if it had worked. But it did seem like the children's fevers broke. They were resting a little more comfortably. And everyone went home, and when they drew up water from the well, it was clean and sweet. When they sat down to dinner, their food was good. It didn't go rotten. And then, in the middle of the night, a few folks who were still lying awake in their beds, they said that they heard a sound on the breeze. Hoo, 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 hoo. And then lightning crashed and thunder rumbled. The skies opened up and it started pouring rain. By morning, the swamp water was as high as it had ever been. It rained and rained, and the city folk, first they brought in even more workers to see if they could drain the swamp faster, and then they thought, well, maybe they'd wait it out for a day or two and then start draining again. But it just kept raining. And the swamp water, it stayed full and high. And finally the city folks, they had to admit that it was going to cost them more to develop on that swamp than they'd ever make from it. So they packed up all their things and they left. And just before that last truck pulled out of the swamp, headed for the city, all those workers who had disappeared stumbled out of the swamp. Confused, they weren't sure what had happened to them, where they'd been. But they managed to get on that truck back home. And the next day, after all the city folks were gone, the rain stopped, the skies cleared, and things pretty much went back to normal after that. It's been a long time since all this happened. But down there in the swamp, they still tell stories about the tiny man. Which makes sense. You know, you don't want to forget about someone who can help you when the floodwaters come. You don't want to forget about someone who's going to get mad if you start draining the swamp. Tiny man without a name likes to laugh and dance in the rain. As long as there's water in the Okefenokee, ain't no harm gonna come to nobody. That's the story of the tiny man. It's a little little bit scary. One of those kind of fairy folk stories. We know that the fairy folk can be fun and interesting, but also a little bit scary. You don't want to mess with them. All right. Then for my next story, it's a little bit scarier. Just a good old-fashioned Southern creepy, spooky story. Once there was a man who lived in a cabin in the woods with his 3 dogs. I know, you know, and don't know. And every day the man and his dogs went out hunting for their dinner. And they had a decent life out there in the woods. But there came a hard winter. They went out day after day and they weren't catching anything. And after a while, they ran out of all the dried meat that they had to eat. And they came home one evening after another failed day of hunting. The man sat in the chair by the fire and the dogs laid around on the floor, all of them sort of half drifting off and listening to their stomachs rumble, not really able to get comfortable because of how hungry they were. And then the man heard a noise over on one side of the cabin. He looked over just in time to see some sort of strange critter climbing in between a gap in the boards of the cabin. The man, as quick as he could, he reached down by his chair and he picked up his axe. That critter ran fast across the cabin. It reached the other wall and it was squeezing itself between another hole in the boards. The man jumped up. He brought his axe down just as the critter disappeared out of the cabin. And he had managed to cut off its tail. He picked up that tail. Now it was mostly fluff. But he skinned it and there was a little bit of meat on the bones. He threw it into his stew pot on top of the fire, added some dried shriveled vegetables from his little garden, poured in some water, and he cooked up a decent stew. He and the dogs ate some of it, and then they left the rest in the pot for the next day. And they went to bed, feeling better than they had in a while. Then, somewhere in the middle of the night, the man startled awake. He wasn't sure at first what had woken him, but he listened. And far out in the forest, he heard something. It sounded kind of like a voice on the breeze. Taily-po, taily-po, I want my taily-po. Made the man shiver. He thought it probably wasn't anything he really needed to worry about, but just in case. He went to his door, he cracked it open, and he told the dogs, "Get it!" The dogs shot out of the door and disappeared into the forest. The man closed the door behind them, and he went back to bed. In the morning, he woke up to see the sunlight slanting through the window. Oh, he got up and stretched. He opened his front door. I know, you know, don't know. Come on. But only 2 dogs came back. Well, the man, and I know and you know, they went out hunting. They stayed out all day. Didn't find any animals. When they came back to the cabin that evening, the man added a little more water to his stew that was left over from the night before. And he and the 2 dogs, they ate some of the stew and left some in the pot for the next day. He climbed into bed, drifted off to sleep. In the middle of the night, he heard a noise. He heard, it sounded like it was right outside of his cabin this time. Taily-po, taily-po. I want my taily-po. The man shivered. He went to the door. He cracked it open. He told the dogs, "Get!" And the dogs ran out. He closed the door behind them and locked it. He climbed back into bed and he listened as he heard the dogs woo, 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 chasing something far out into the woods. He finally fell back asleep, and then he woke up in the morning. He went to the door, threw it open, and he called to his dogs, "I know, you know, don't know." Only one dog came back. Well, that day, the man and his one dog, I know, they went out into the forest hunting, but they weren't able to get any food for dinner. So they came home and they still just had that leftover stew in the pot. The man added more water. It was getting pretty thin at this point. They ate a little and saved some for the next day. And this time, before he even went to bed, the man locked the door. He climbed into his bed and pulled his blanket up to his chin. He lay there staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours, but he must have fallen asleep. Because he woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, and he could hear the sound of claws scrabbling around on the outside of the cabin. Taily-po, taily-po, I want my taily-po. The man went over to the door. He waited until it sounded like the claws were on the other side of the cabin. He cracked the door and he told his one dog, "Get!" Slammed the door shut, locked it, and he grabbed his chair and propped it up underneath the doorknob to barricade the door. And he listened. The claws stopped scrabbling around on the outside of the cabin. The dog chased the critter out into the forest. The man went back to bed. He woke up in the morning with the sunlight shining through his window. He went over to the door and moved the chair, unlocked it, threw it open, and he called to his dogs, "I know, you know, don't know." And no dogs came back. The man did go out hunting that day by himself, but he didn't stay out very long, and he didn't go very far from his cabin. And unsurprisingly, he came home empty-handed again. He added more water to his stew. He was pretty sure it was only water at this point. But he ate it. Before he even went to bed, he closed and locked the door. He put the chair under the doorknob again to barricade it. He got into bed and he pulled the covers all the way up to his chin, and he lay there. He finally fell asleep. But again, he woke up in the middle of the night to the sounds of scrabbling claws, only this time he had an eerie feeling that the critter was inside the cabin. And he listened to it scrabble around on the walls. And then he heard its claws on the floor. Taily-po, taily-po, I want my taily-po. And then thump, he felt the critter land on the foot of the bed. And it crept up toward his face. He could see its red eyes. As it got closer, he could see its white fangs. And as it crept toward him, I know, and you know, that you've got my taily-po. And then that critter, it scrambled all over the cabin and tore the whole place apart until there was nothing left but the brick chimney, just standing there, alone in the forest. Now, they say, if you're wandering around those parts alone on a winter's day, you might hear something strange. And maybe it's just the sound of the wind whistling through that brick chimney. But people swear they've heard a voice. Taily-po, taily-po, I got my taily-po. There you go, that's the story of Taily-po. And I have to tell you that sometimes when I'm hiking out in the woods, I will see a chimney. The only thing that's left from some cabin, some structure that was once there. And it always gives me the creeps because that reminds me of Taily-po. All right, well, part of the fun of scary stories is sharing them with other people and seeing if you can scare them. So I invite you to tell these stories to your family and friends and to learn other scary stories that you can tell. Thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. I will see you next time.